Hey everyone, this is Mötley, Crüe, and modern JavaScript. I want to thank you all for coming because I know that I'm actually the only person standing between you and free beer right now. So I promise this will be fun, and hopefully we'll actually learn something too. So today I want to talk about JavaScript. And JavaScript is kind of boring by itself, so I actually want to talk about metal music and JavaScript because that's more interesting. And I actually think that the arc of metal music in some ways actually follows the arc of front-end development to a degree as well. And so I think it helps the message stick a little bit better if we compare the two. So to see what I mean, think about 1968. 3 bands came on the scene that sort of defined this new style of music called metal music, right? And if we look in the front-end space, we can see that there were similar things in the JavaScript world. Dojo, MooTools, Prototype, right? These were the first libraries that really showed us that you could do interesting things with JavaScript. It wasn't just a toy language. And metal music was so popular that there were tons and tons of bands that wanted to either imitate that sound, like Black Sabbath sound, or maybe they wanted to iterate on it. Maybe they had some new ideas about how they could sound, right? And we see a similar proliferation with JavaScript frameworks. There are dozens and dozens. And in fact, there's probably going to be 4 new JavaScript frameworks before this talk is over, right? The key thing to remember here is not all of those are going to be winners. And that's exactly what this talk is about, is how do you actually know if JavaScript framework is the new hotness or it's actually valuable? Because the JavaScript choices you make are important, right? If you pick the wrong framework, you might end up like using Angular, for example, right? And Angular is going to suffer the same fate that Anthrax did back in the 80s, right? But maybe you pick Vue, and maybe that has more staying power, kind of like Van Halen. So who am I? My name is Eric Brandis, and I lead 2 Lives. I'm an enterprise consultant for big Fortune 500 companies, and I develop web applications for them. And for the last decade or so, it's been single-page applications, which is great because it's given me a chance to use most of the frameworks in production. I'm also the co-founder of a JavaScript error monitoring company called Track.js. And we process somewhere around 1 billion errors per month at the moment, and we're growing all the time. Our average customer experiences a JavaScript error about 50% of times when they load a page. So it gives me a great perspective. I get to see how these web applications fail kind of from both sides of the aisle. And because it's JavaScript, they fail a lot. If we look at front-end development, these days, front-end development is a real thing. It's actually a job. You can find job postings for front-end engineers. 10 years ago, that wasn't really the case. The reason that there are jobs now specifically devoted to the front end is because it's gotten more complicated, right? A good example of this is something called the front-end checklist. So I've actually attached a full-page screenshot to the slide. Of course, you can't read it because that front-end checklist is super, super long, but that's kind of the point, right? It used to be, I don't know, put some HTML on a page, do some JavaScript, and you're good. But now there's hundreds of things that you need to think about. I actually have taken the liberty of kind of parsing out that front-end checklist and just putting it into some ugly bullet points. And don't worry, we're not going to go over all of these. But I just want to illustrate the point that there's a lot going on in the front-end landscape now. For example, this is the section on JavaScript. So this is pretty simple at first glance, right? It talks about concatenation. It talks about minification, non-blocking. That all makes sense, right? It's pretty straightforward. But these days, when you build a web application, the JavaScript frameworks that you choose, they don't just impact the JavaScript-specific parts of your website. How are you actually going to do all the different meta tags, the favicons, all of the different things that you need for mobile apps these days, right? The JavaScript frameworks that you choose are going to impact that as well, right? Look at all these different things that you need to think about just for the head tag of a web application, right? There's dozens of things here. Same with CSS, right? I mean, CSS, you'd think it would be completely separate from the JavaScript choices you make, but that's not true, right? The JavaScript framework that you use might very well impact how you write your CSS, how your images are loaded, how are you going to do multiple resolutions to support Retina displays and things like that. Accessibility is a huge one. The JavaScript choices that you make are going to directly impact how accessible your website is. You also got performance and SEO, right? And so all of these things these days, there's many, many things to consider, and all of them are impacted by the JavaScript frameworks that you pick. And that's just for basic web apps. There's a new kind of web app coming on the scene that a lot of people are very excited about called progressive web apps, right? They are essentially regular web apps turned up to 11. Google has helpfully included another checklist for us. And as you can see, I've taken a screenshot of this one too, and it's also very long. So it's all the same things. You have to do all the stuff that you'd normally do on the front-end checklist, but then if you want to do a progressive web application, you actually have to do even more. And again, I've taken the liberty of breaking apart some of these things for you. I want to focus on two in particular. What Google says about progressive web apps is, number one, is the content shouldn't jump as the page loads. I don't know about you, but basically every mobile website that I go to, I'll try and click on a link, but before my tap is registered, something new has loaded and caused me to not be able to click the thing that I wanted. And the second thing is even more important. Pressing back from a detail page retains the scroll position of the previous list page. In 2018, Google felt it was necessary to call out that the back button should still work, right? And they did that because the back button almost never works in single-page applications. You have to do a lot of hoop jumping to get that back button to work reliably. And here's a couple of other things, right, that progressive web apps are going to want you to do. And again, if you just read any number of these, you can understand how impactful the JavaScript choices you make are. So basically, if you make the wrong JavaScript choices, instead of your front-end development experience being super meta like this, it's more like a Michael Bolton kind of like adult contemporary experience. And instead of your progressive web apps being super awesome and your development story being great, it's more like Vegas crooner style. And as our friend Slayer say, if you make the wrong JavaScript choices, hell awaits, right? So there's an old saying, and I don't even know who said it, but it's those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, right? And we see this in tech all the time. People keep reinventing the wheel, right? Because they don't remember the problems of yesterday. So if we take our music analogy, right, let's look at kind of the beginning of rock and roll. So even predating, Sabbath and Zeppelin, right? Like there was rock music, and I don't want to get in like a holy war, but you could argue that Elvis Presley was the originator of rock and roll, right? You could probably argue other things as well. And Elvis Presley's music didn't sound anything like the metal music that Sabbath and those guys were making, right? But the web actually follows a similar arc. So way back in the day, in 1993 or whatever, Tim Berners-Lee came up with HTML, right? There was no JavaScript at that time, right? This is a picture of the first web page that was ever created. What's kind of interesting about this web page actually is that the back button works really reliably on this all the time. And actually it loads great over 3G. It's probably responsive, right? I mean, it's just Times New Roman and some hyperlinks. So this page still works great today, just like some people will tell you that Elvis's music is still good today and that maybe he's still with us. But rock music evolved, right? We got to the Beatles, right? I think everybody knows who they are, just classic, legendary musicians. I think a similar equivalent in the front-end space would be the form post, right? This was the first time that you could take data from your user and bring it back to your server. And this was pretty cool. This allowed a two-way street for web applications. Some people don't actually know what a form post does, and that's okay. But I've worked with a bunch of younger developers, and they've never actually done a full form post in a browser. They just use Ajax for everything, right? They didn't actually know that the browser could submit data some other way, which I thought was really interesting. And after the Beatles, we get the Rolling Stones, right? It's a little bit harsher sound. It's got, a little bit more of that overdrive, a little bit more amps, right? And we start to see a similar arc in the front-end development space, right? We're getting a little bit more rock and roll here. We've got PHP now, right? And now we can dynamically render things on the server. So if I want, for example, an array of tacos, different kinds of taco filling, now my server can do that, and you can hook that up to a database, and now you've got dynamic HTML. And of course, then we get to Sabbath, right? Who was the, kind of the founding rock group, one of metal music. And kind of that equivalent person in the JavaScript space is probably Brendan Eich, right? I mean, he's the person who created the language, right? And if the accounts are to be believed, he did it in 2 weeks. There's a huge deadline, and that's kind of why JavaScript looks the way it does, right? That's about the best that you could do in 2 weeks, I think. But once JavaScript came out, we could start doing dynamic HTML. I don't know if any of you even remember this term, right? This is a really old term. It used to be called DHTML, and this was back in the 90s. And that's where this image came from. actually, is the 90s. You can tell because it's like super Photoshop with all the embossing and all that stuff. You don't hear too much about DHTML anymore, but it was pretty cool. You could use JavaScript to hide and show things. You could change the status bar on your browser, right? You could make things animate across the screen. You know, it opened the door a little bit. Of course, then we get Led Zeppelin. We talked about them already. And then we get the JavaScript equivalent, right? Prototype, Dojo, MooTools. Now, I don't know about y'all, but these were the first frameworks that I really used, and I was blown away that kind of a toy language like JavaScript could actually be used to implement business logic. I thought that was pretty cool. But then things started getting real interesting, right? The rock musicians traded in their kind of staid looks for like skin-tight vinyl suits and platform boots, right? And that like really kind of changed the game on metal music and really gave it a whole new sound and a whole new direction. And I think that you could argue that John Resig did something similar when he created jQuery. jQuery is still in use on like 30% of the top 1,000 websites. And as much as people malign it today, it is still one of the best ways to get things done quickly and easily. And eventually, we saw a band called Metallica come out, and they had this like dark, gritty sound that nobody had really been able to make a sound like that before, right? And so that was kind of a new iteration. And in the JavaScript space, something similarly transformative was happening. So this doesn't look like much, right? It's a little jQuery selector, and it sets some HTML. But for those of you that are kind of familiar with the arc of JavaScript, this was really the first client-side rendered application, right? This was using JavaScript to write markup. And of course, developers being developers, they see this and they're like, oh, this is super cool, right? I don't need to use the server to generate HTML anymore. I'm just going to do it all in JavaScript, right? So if you want to do that same list of tacos that PHP was rendering, you can just do it with jQuery now, right? Super easy. You don't even need to talk to the server. Of course, as anybody who's been in this kind of world knows, this stuff is super unmaintainable. Like this is called jQuery soup sometimes. You get enough of this stuff and your app is impenetrable. You cannot maintain it. Of course, then we get to the kind of the namesake, the self-title of this talk, the Mötley Crüe era. And this is that 80s glam hair metal when things like really got glitzy and huge. And in the front-end landscape, I think the equivalent would be Gmail. So I don't know how many of you remember Gmail when it first came out, but it was a game changer. It felt like a desktop application on the web. And everyone's like, how are they doing that? Like when I click on my email, it's not a big full page paint. I click on the email and boom, it's there, right? It felt like Outlook. And the way they did that was with clever caching and client-side rendering, or what we'd call today as single-page applications. And everybody saw Gmail, just like everybody saw Mötley Crüe, right? And they said, I want to do that too. And so we get loads of frameworks that came out to help us with our client-side rendering. We've got Backbone, right? Which I've personally worked on thousands of lines of Backbone, right? It did what it did at its time. We had Knockout. We had Angular. I mostly just wanted to have fun photoshopping a lot of these photos, which is a big part of the reason I did this talk in the first place. And now we've got kind of what I would call the second wave, kind of the second generation of JavaScript frameworks. We've got like React and Redux, right? And kind of similarly, like with metal, we're kind of out of that 80s hair metal now, right? Now we're more into like a kind of a darker, like call it black metal, death metal, that kind of thing. And we've got Angular. It's just called Angular. Used to be called Angular 2, but then they changed the version number so often that you couldn't just call it that. So they call it Angular, which is not to be confused with the original version of Angular, which is now called AngularJS. But so for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to call it Angular 2, right? Which is the new Angular framework from Google. And we've also got Vue, right? Which is kind of this dark horse. It's written by a small group of open source developers. But now we've got loads and loads of front-end tools, right? How do we make sense of all of it? We've got, it's just like in music. There's a million bands making a million songs, and the barrier to entry has never been lower. But not all of it's very good. So if you're building a new web application in 2018, what kind of stack do you pick for your front end? Now, we have some goals, right? We want it to be fast loading. We want it to have a good user experience, good performance once it's loaded. It shouldn't be all janky. If a user does an interaction, it should work well. We want it to be quick to develop. We don't want to have our developers churning a bunch of time because developers cost a lot of money, right? And we want it to be easy to maintain. Now, What comes next in this talk is my opinions. And so some of these opinions may rub some of you the wrong way. And so after this talk, if you're like, dude, you are totally wrong, feel free to come up and have a chat with me about it. So this is just my opinion of how you should sort of evaluate things in the front-end landscape today. So I think the first question that you need to ask is, how dynamic is your site, right? So I think there's a difference between if it's a mostly static site or a super dynamic site, right? So if you say mostly static, and what do I mean by mostly static? What I mean is, does every user get a tailored experience? Do they log in and have this auth barrier and like every page is rendered custom for each user? Or is it kind of the same? Like whoever hits the site, you're kind of going to get the same experience, right? So static sites are things like blogs, marketing sites, documentation, that sort of thing. They're not necessarily static in the sense that the content doesn't change. They're static in the sense that you can actually build them with static front-end assets, right? So what do I mean? Like, what's an example, right? So one of the first static site generators ever created was called Jekyll. And there are a lot of great things to recommend Jekyll. The biggest one, in my opinion, is that you can actually host your Jekyll apps for free on GitHub with your own custom domain, and they will handle all of it for you, which is super cool. But there's a lot of other nice things. The deployment story, even if you don't use GitHub Pages, is really simple. At its core, Jekyll takes some Markdown files, some JavaScript, and whatever, and it actually spits out HTML files based on various criteria. Deployment is as simple as FTP. You can just X-copy this thing wherever you want it, right? There's a huge community involved, and it's still quite actively used. But Jekyll's getting a little long in the tooth, right? So there's, of course, the developer community has to come up with new ideas. And so the latest kind of cool kid on the block is called Gatsby. Gatsby is another static site generator. It's currently used on things like the React documentation. What's interesting about Gatsby is that it actually uses React to generate static sites. So the whole thing is I'm old and crotchety, and so for me it's a little bit too fancy, but a lot of people are really enjoying Gatsby today. And once you get it working, again, you get that great deployment story, and it's quite simple in terms of complexity. So in general, I guess my main point is that if you can get away with it, I would recommend a static website. But if we go back to that question of how dynamic is your site, and if you're like, it's super dynamic, right? Like I've got to be changing things all the time. It's custom per user, right? We're going to go to the database. We're going to hit the database 35 times. We've got microservices galore, right? This thing is super custom. So the next question I think you need to ask is, do you go to the server every time a user clicks on something, right? Because a lot of people's first reaction is going to say, I'm going to use React, or I'm going to use Angular. But what happens most of the time is that whenever a user clicks on a link or changes pages in a single-page application, almost always the app is going to get some more JSON from a REST API. And I'll tell you, if every time a user in your app clicks on something, you need to go back to the server to get more data, then I have good news. You don't need to mess around with React or Angular or single-page applications at all, right? And the reason you don't have to is because of Ajax. Ajax predates all of this stuff. It was originally created by Microsoft for Outlook web access back in 2000 or whatever, and it was originally an ActiveX control. And Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Now, XML is not something that anybody wants to deal with anymore, right? But what's interesting about Ajax is that even though the X stands for XML, what it really can mean is HTML. And so what you can do is you can go to the server, because you're going to have to go to the server anyways, and instead of returning JSON, you can return HTML. And if you do that, your render function looks something like this, right? This is the fastest way to render any kind of markup in a browser, even in 2018. React with all of its virtual DOM tricks, Ember with its Glimmer VM, none of them can match the speed of a big old inner HTML, full of a string of HTML, because browsers are really good at handling that exact situation. Now, we don't want to roll our own Ajax, XML, HTML framework, right? And the good thing is we don't have to. The great folks at GitHub actually, in fact, I guess he's not the CEO anymore, but Chris Wanstroth, who was the kind of interim CEO, he actually created a library called PJAX. And PJAX stands for Push State plus JavaScript and Ajax. And essentially, it's a framework to let you basically server render everything but via Ajax, so you get, like, there's no white page refresh. It all feels very fluid and smooth. And in fact, when you go to github.com, when you're browsing around a repository, that's exactly what's happening. They use PJAX internally on github.com. And so when you're in a repository and you're clicking around, it's actually going back to the server, and it's actually getting markup, and it's actually plopping it on the page. So I just want to take a look real quickly about kind of how does that work. So the way PJAX does what it does is the first time you go to a website, you get the full page, right? You get the head tag with all of its various CSS or whatever you want to put in there. You get that blue box at the bottom, which is where your scripts are going to go, right? Because you're still going to need some JavaScript. GitHub still has interactivity. GitHub still has JavaScript. It doesn't preclude that. You load that, and then that red box is called the PJAX container. And that's basically kind of the main content window of your site. And that's the part that gets replaced with Ajax every time the user clicks on something. Now, what's great about that is you only have to pay to load the script bundle once. You only pay to load the CSS once, because that's in the head tag or at the bottom of the page. And only the part in red is changing. So if we actually open up the dev tools and look at a page, I'm actually looking at the PJAX repository on GitHub, you can see that in the response, the content coming back is not JSON. It's actually HTML. And GitHub, if you've used it, it's quite fast, right? And it's quite snappy, and it feels like a nice application. So you don't actually need React or something to get that interactivity. YouTube used to use a similar concept. They don't anymore, but for years they did. And so there's a lot of great things to like about PJAX. And if you take away anything from this talk, I hope is that at least if the next time you're building a web application, you think, hey, maybe I should use or at least investigate PJAX. Loads of pros for it. It's super easy to, you can shoehorn it into just about any site that's still existing. It's really simple. I mean, it's like 2 KB of script or something. The only cons for it really are that it's done. They don't work on it anymore. There's no new features coming, not because it's outdated or old, but because they just don't want to do any more features. It works for them, and that's okay. One of the best parts about PJAX is that the back button flipping works, right? Which I harp on the back button a lot, but it always worked really good until we came out with all this single page nonsense, right? And it's like, well, how did we break such critical functionality? And if you don't believe me that JavaScript, single page applications maybe aren't the first choice, there's a great blog post by a guy named Adi Osmani, who is on the Google Chrome team, and it's called The Cost of JS, right? And his whole point is that JS has a lot of cost, not just from the amount of script that you're pulling down, but you've got to parse and compile this stuff, right? You've got to decompress it if you're gonna, gzip it or whatever, right? And then he talks about a bunch of ways that you can kind of eliminate this problem, right? Things like code splitting with dynamic import, right? Which is only supported in super cutting edge versions of Webpack and TypeScript and things. You can minify everything. Obviously, tree shaking. Tree shaking is kind of the big new hotness, right? Instead of pulling in a whole library, that the tools are smart enough to figure out which parts of the library are you using, and then we'll only include those in the bundle. So that's cool. So there's a lot of interesting ideas he has here about how to kind of avoid having too much JavaScript. Or you could just do what I propose and render everything on the server, and you don't have any of that stuff to worry about. It keeps it really simple. And if I still haven't convinced you that server rendering still has a place in the modern web stack, Netflix, because the Netflix folks are always on the cutting edge, right? They're pushing everything to the limit, and they're always doing interesting things, which is funny because their UI is actually the simplest UI on earth. And I don't know why there's so many people that actually have to work on that UI. Maybe because they do all this crazy cutting edge stuff. But they removed client-side React from their homepage, and they saw 50% performance improvement on the landing page, right? That's pretty significant. That's legit. And maybe you don't want to use PJAX, or maybe PJAX doesn't fit your idea of kind of how you want the website to work. Well, that's okay. There's other options. So the Ruby on Rails folks have been using for years something called TurboLinks. And TurboLinks is kind of a PJAX-like competitor. It's a little bit more robust and kind of do a little bit more. It's now separated from Ruby on Rails. It'll now work in a Node environment, right? So if you're doing Node on the server, if you've got kind of a Node sort of middle tier, you could use TurboLinks if you wanted to. And the Ruby on Rails stuff has always been very pragmatic, right? It's always all about kind of just getting the job done. The same people David Heinemeier Hansen and the folks at 37 Signals have recently come up with another framework aimed to kind of simplify front-end development. It's called Stimulus. And this is just a screenshot of the homepage, right? A modest JavaScript framework for the HTML you already have. So they want you to use it with turbolinks, right? And in turbolinks, you're going to server render, you're going to get that HTML on the page, and then you can kind of sprinkle in that interactivity with Stimulus, right? And that's kind of the idea. And Stimulus is very new. In the last maybe 4 months has it come out. It's already got several thousand stars on GitHub. And in general, the 37 Signals folks seem to put out pretty good products. So something to keep an eye on for sure. But you're probably not here to talk about any of the non-single page application stuff, right? So fine, we'll build a single page application. There are absolutely use cases that can benefit from this. But it's probably worth discussing that there are also costs, right? This is not a panacea. Doing the single page thing means that you get a lot of new issues that you wouldn't have had before, right? Routing and navigation is always a pain in single page applications. State management is something I'm going to come back to again, but state management is actually one of those things that nobody really thinks about until they're in a really bad situation. So you've got to figure out what is your state management scenario. In a server-rendered application, it's on the server, right? We've already got kind of known patterns for that. Component communication, you've got rendering like jitter and jank. And at the very end, I'm going to call what I call placeholder madness, right? And so if you go to a lot of these single page applications these days, you might see something like this. And it's just like placeholders and spinners, right? And someone thinks that this is a better experience than server rendering. And I think that's super funny. And when you choose to do a single page application, you're also going to encounter these tough looking guys when it comes time to figure out your build tooling, right? I would say that build tooling is probably one of the biggest costs that you're going to run into when you really get into the single page applications, because you don't just load a script anymore, right? You actually have to transpile, and you have to do all this minification and all this tree shaking and all this other stuff, right? To do that, you need to use build tools. Which build tools should you use? Well, NPM is kind of the original in terms of this, very client-side, whatever. Really, there was Bower before that, but we don't talk about Bower anymore because nobody uses it. Sorry if you do. But so NPM is kind of the big elephant, right? There's a lot of NPM packages. It works pretty good. But then the folks I think it was Facebook, they were like, well, NPM's got some shortcomings. So we're going to create this thing called Yarn. So a lot of people are using Yarn now. Yarn is supposed to have a little better performance. Kind of in my opinion, it feels like NPM 5 addressed a lot of the sins of the father. Personally, I'd stick with NPM, but Yarn is also a viable option. But when you have these dependency managers, the one thing about NPM in general, because of course Yarn is also pulling from the same package repositories, one of the problems really is that you kind of open yourself to indeterminate builds, because you're pulling this stuff from the cloud, right? You're pulling these libraries from NPM or from GitHub or from wherever. And you can also open yourself to kind of some security issues, right? Because everyone's putting a crypto miner in everything now, right? I was just seeing that favicons are now mining cryptocurrency, right? Because favicons support SVG, which supports JavaScript, AKA we're going to mine some crypto coins, right? But the same thing can happen with Node, right? Because you don't know. If you've got 25 dependencies and those each have 10 dependencies, you've got hundreds of repos that you don't control, that you've never vetted, that could change out from under your feet and cause security issues or all sorts of things. And if you're building for the web, right, NPM or Yarn is not sufficient, all right, because that's actually made for more of a Node environment. So you need something to turn that Node-based JavaScript, or that kind of server-side, whatever, NPM-based JavaScript, into something that can actually run in a browser. And there's other tools that can do it, but right now, Webpack is sort of the thing that you'd want to use, right? It's got the most mind share, it's got the biggest community, people are really enjoying it. But what they're not enjoying about Webpack is the configuration. So if anybody in this room has actually configured Webpack, you're probably like, oh, that is the worst. I always got to look up how to do it. And then the Webpack developers decided to release version 4, which broke total compatibility with version 2 and 3, and so everybody had to scramble to redo everything. The docs weren't published on time. It was kind of a big mess. So Webpack configuration is never pleasant. And it's always kind of convoluted. When you go back and look at your Webpack config like 2 weeks later, you're like, what is this for? Like, why? Like, there's so much regexing, there's so much testing, loading, all this like node stuff. It's just brutal. So then you've got to pick a JavaScript framework, right? So we're going to use Webpack. We're probably going to use NPM because I'm at least old and crotchety, and Yarn is a little too fancy for me. Now I need to pick a JavaScript framework. Now, there's dozens of JavaScript frameworks, but I'm only going to focus on 3 of them for the purpose of this talk. And the reason is because I don't think there's a lot of value in having a million. I think let's pick a couple of tools that we think are good and have big communities and are going to stand the test of time and use those. So we're going to talk about Angular, Vue, and React, right? And I know like a lot of people know what these are, so I'm not going to talk about how they work really, but just like why you'd use one over the other and kind of what's good and maybe bad about them in 2018. I do want to call out real quick a special kind of honorable mention for Polymer. So Polymer is another framework from Google, and some of you may have heard of it. It is supposed to like harness the power of web components. Now, I've had a number of discussions with people here so far at the conference about web components. My own personal stance on web components in Polymer is that if you built a successful application with Polymer, you could have built the same application without Polymer in half the time and for half the money, right? Polymer is, in my opinion, nothing but a time and money sink. So that's all we're going to say about it, but like I don't think it's worth even investigating in 2018. But like web components, in all of these Angular, Vue, and React, everything is a component, right? And that's kind of the new primitive that we're using these days on the front end. And people just get so excited about components because they're reusable, right? If I have this component and it works, I can just stamp this thing out on every page in my app. The problem is, how often do you need to do that, right? How many things actually like are used on every page of the app that you don't put in some kind of layout or some kind of menu component or whatever, right? There's not really a huge use case for this reusability, like to stamp these things, oh, the share button for Facebook or whatever. Yeah, I guess. But I'm not really convinced by that reusability argument. Another argument that people like to say about components is isolation, right? Well, the component's all by itself. It's its own little atomic piece of functionality. Isn't that great? No, it's not, because applications are many components. And those components need to work together to give you the experience that you want. A component in isolation is pretty useless, right? So what ends up happening is you get really complicated state management, right? And that's the big thing that I really want to focus on kind of for the rest of the talk, is that nobody really considers state management as an important scenario until you start building these single-page applications and you realize what a complicated disaster you've got on your hands. So I just want to look back again historically at how websites used to work, right? So this was kind of a traditional website. You've got your browser, it hits a web server, that web server probably talks to a database, right? Those were the good old days when things made sense. And then people decided, well, I need some user-specific kind of like cached data. Like as the user's logged in, I kind of want to keep maybe their shopping cart around, the products they've been viewing, whatever, right? So now I've got session. And session could be in proc, it could be in a database, it could be in something like Redis, right? And then we need some level 2 caching, or at least some other caching. So we've got Redis now, right? So now we've got session, which is stored who knows where. We've got Redis for various like level 2 caching items, and we've got a database, right? So our state is starting to get separated. And then, for reasons unbeknownst to me, microservices took off. And we said, instead of having a single database, let's separate all of our different kind of data stores by unreliable network boundaries, and then we'll use those. And so now our state is like all over the place, right? And there's a lot of issues managing it on the server. But that wasn't enough. Our jobs weren't secure enough yet. We needed to do the same thing on the client side, right? So now we've got all this stuff on the server dealing with state, and then we still have to deal with the same thing on the client side, right? That state is now mirrored in 2 places, or God help you if it's only on the client side, right? And so how does this relate to the real world? So I think this is a super common sort of UX paradigm, right? It's a simple shopping cart. On the left, you've got a list of products and prices with their quantities. On the right, you've got a little subtotal block, and then on the bottom right, you've got kind of an upsell thing, like some products you might enjoy. And so in the world of components, right, we'd probably break this thing up. we've got that top bar, it's maybe a search box, then we've got kind of the departments thing, and subtotal's its own box, the product list its own box, its own component, whatever. But those are kind of big components, right? And developers love to just really get granular with those components. And so we'd probably break those up further, right? I mean, we can, maybe each product in the list is its own component, right? And maybe the price is its own component. Maybe the quantity dropdown is its own component. And we can take it as far as we want to, right? We can do, components everywhere. You end up getting something that looks like this really terrible diagram that I made in PowerPoint in 5 minutes, which is basically a component hierarchy, right? This is what an application looks like when you're using any of these frameworks. It's components all the way down, you might say. So what happens when the user does something? So if you look at those red boxes, and I'll remove the component outline. So whenever I interact with those red boxes, right, something changes. I'm either deleting the product, I'm changing the quantity, I'm adding a new product to the shopping cart, right? So whenever I do any of those things, the things in the blue boxes need to update. And this seems obvious, right? Like, of course, like if I click on, delete this product, my total is going to change. The problem is these component-based hierarchies out of the box don't give us any good tools to have one component communicate with the other. So let's look at Angular. Let's see how Angular would handle this particular problem. And by the way, the shopping cart problem is actually, it's a good litmus test, really, of just like any kind of new framework of like, how easy would it be for me to build that shopping cart experience? And if it's not like hilariously easy, probably not the right tool for the job. This is an Angular component. It's from the Angular docs. A couple things to call out here. One, there's 4 imports at the top just to get the most basic component in the world, right? You've got some fancy attributes, which is a TypeScript thing. And then you've got this awful string template. So we've got actually no tool checking available to us because our templates are strings. So if we make a mistake, right, if we have a typo in there, we don't know until runtime. Or at least we didn't. Angular 5 or 6 has released AOT compiling that you can use in some cases when the stars align and your app has no legacy. You can sometimes use AOT compilation, and that will tell you if your templates have issues. But string templates in general are kind of an anti-pattern in 2018, I think. And then you've got inputs and outputs, and you've got a lot of boilerplate. It really is like an enterprise Java app to some degree. And of course, Angular doesn't really have a great state management system. They have providers, and they have kind of service-type things, but you've got your state all over the place, right? And so you're still having trouble managing it. And so the new trend in the front end is to have a global state management solution, right? Remember we were always taught that global variables were bad? Well, not in 2018, they're not. So the Angular solution to this problem is called NGRX. And NGRX is a community-driven project that has sort of it's a noble goal, anyways. But it uses observables because Angular loves observables. Me personally, I'm not a huge observable fan. So observables are kind of like the Limp Bizkit of music. Like they were seemed cool at first, but then over time we sort of realized that maybe there's some issues there. Some of those issues include, so first of all, observables are a collection of items or events over time, right? And so anytime that anybody mentions over time, I get nervous because time is very hard, right? Time, adding that fourth dimension is always tricky. Then you have this notion of hot versus cold observables. So in the world of observables, sometimes when you subscribe to an observable, it will start feeding you data once you subscribe. But sometimes it's just firing data. And if you don't subscribe in time, you'll miss some of those events. The problem is you don't know which one you're dealing with. There is no way to know, is this a hot or cold observable? You've also got finite versus infinite observables. So some observables will just spit out events forever, infinitely all the time, right? So the key press observable, right? In if you do RxJS observable from event, right? That thing is infinite, right? Because it doesn't know, you could give a key press at any moment. But some observables are finite. Maybe there's only a list of 10 things, right? Well, why does this matter? This matters because in the world of observables, oftentimes you're composing observables, right? You might have 2 or 3 or 4 observables that you need to map into a single stream of events or process kind of combined. And when you do that, you need a flattening strategy. And depending on the flattening strategy you choose, if you have an infinite observable in there, it might just hang forever and your app will never work. And good luck debugging that. It's super fun. Also, there's no async await support, right? So JavaScript sort of finally finalized on an async pattern and they said, let's do async await with promises. That's not observables. And then also a big thing in Angular specifically is that they model network events as observables. Now, there are a lot of good examples of things that are observables. I just watched a great talk earlier today about real-time trading platforms. Great use case for observables. Ajax calls where there's only one response, maybe not the best case for observables, right? It seems like using a chainsaw to cut a birthday cake, kind of. And there's a bunch of other good reasons to avoid Angular. The unit testing story is awful. The performance isn't very good once you start to get a reasonably complicated app. User input and forms are really complicated. Like, it's actually hard to take user input data now. There's an upgrade treadmill. The Angular developers love to do breaking changes between major versions. Most recently, between 4 and 5, they completely deprecated and removed their old HTTP stack and make you use a new one, so that literally you had to rewrite every HTTP call in your application to upgrade. In my opinion, Angular 2 was their chance to get all of this right. They did not. And then also you've got Angular CLI. So if you want to do unit testing in 2018 in Angular, you have to use Angular CLI. They've officially deprecated any other way to do it. The problem there is that Angular CLI can only be used for brand new greenfield Angular 2 apps. If you have any legacy AngularJS and you're using Angular Upgrade, you are, pardon my French, but shit out of luck. So in my opinion, Angular is kind of like these folks here. Like, this is about as metal as Angular gets, in my opinion. So let's talk about Vue. Same deal. Components, right? Everybody's just components. Everybody's super excited. Going back to that shopping cart example, right? How would we have the components communicate with each other? Vue's solution is Vuex, or Vuex. It is a much simpler global state container. It just uses mainly objects. And Vue as a whole has a lot less boilerplate. It's kind of like an Angular light in a lot of ways, although the Vue folks might not like that I say that. So from my perspective, Vue is kind of interesting. And like, if you've got kind of a smaller app or something and you want to use Vue just because it's cool or different, like, I think that's totally reasonable. Some of the nice things about Vue are usually when you make a Vue component, your script, your markup, and your styles are all in the same file, which can be kind of nice, as long as you use Webpack loaders to do it. But unit testing is still kind of tricky. The binding syntax is a little funky. And also, it's two-way data binding. So I'm not a huge fan of two-way data binding, especially for big apps, because in general, that kind of two-way data flow starts to get real complicated real fast as you have either tricky logic or complicated UX. So Vue is OK. So my preference is React, which in 2018 saying use React is like the least profound thing that I could say, right? Because everybody likes React. Like 80% of new projects are React or whatever, right? Great. But I want to talk about why I like React, because I've actually liked React from day one. And I am a crotchety old developer. And so like when I first saw React, I was like, this is actually solving a problem in a way that we haven't really seen before. And there's two things that React did that were new and novel that helped app developers, in my opinion. The first was the virtual DOM. You've probably heard about it. People are really excited about it. Instead of doing all the DOM manipulation, you kind of change an in-memory DOM, and then you do a quick diff, and you apply the diff to the real DOM, right? Which lets you do some things very quickly. The main advantage it has is actually that it lets you re-render the entire page, right? It lets you basically be like PJAX. I can re-render the whole screen at once without figuring out which components should update and that kind of thing. The other thing, it's not really an invention, it's more of an idea, was the Flux architecture, right? And this is basically a unidirectional data flow. And I'd always been pretty down on two-way data binding. For me, it always resulted in unnecessary complexity. And so when I heard about one-way data binding, I was like, oh, now this is better. There's less cognitive overhead. There's less to reason about. And so they've kind of codified that in terms of Redux, right? That's kind of their Flux. I mean, they hired the guy who wrote it, right, at Facebook. And Redux is pretty great for big apps especially, right? It's probably not necessary for little apps because actually as of React like 16.0 or 16.1, they actually have formalized the context API too. So if you just have a little bit of state that you want to pass around to all your components, you can use the context API. And they've kind of officially supported it now. So if we go back to that shopping cart example, right? When I click one of those red buttons and the blue buttons need to change, right? Because of the virtual DOM and because of the Flux architecture, I can fire an action that says, hey, I changed the quantity. The store gets that action and says, OK, quantity plus plus, re-render the world, right? And really, it's a little bit smarter about that in terms of what it re-renders. But that virtual DOM gives you a lot of leeway in terms of performance to kind of do bad things and still make it out okay. And the last thing I like about React really is JSX, which was like kind of this, wild templating syntax, right? It's like HTML in your JavaScript, what? Like that's horrible. But it turns out it's actually pretty nice, and you get great tooling support with it. And so instead of having a string template, you've actually got something that a tool can really work on. So I think there's a lot of pros with React. One of the other big ones I like is that you can actually server render if you want to. And I'm a huge proponent of server rendering, so that's super great. They're pretty good about backwards compatibility, deprecating APIs. It's a small API surface area. You can learn the whole thing in like a day. They've got a pretty good unit testing story. It's still a little funky with Jest, but it's a lot better than Vue or Angular. The biggest downside is just that there is a fair amount of complexity in your setup, I would say. But there's even more cool stuff about React because you got React Native, which until recently, actually, I was kind of like, React Native is cool if you want it. But I don't know if anybody saw this bombshell. But this was yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, but one of the program managers at Microsoft working on a bunch of this stuff is saying, hey, we've actually almost entirely rewritten all of the Office Suite's UIs in React Native, of all things, right? Which is pretty wild. So details are still coming out about what does he actually mean when he says this. But clearly the Microsoft folks are making big bets on React and React Native, which bodes well for its continued existence. And they use TypeScript. And so now there is official TSX support. There's official TypeScript documentation. There's all sorts of good TypeScript goodies you can get if you want to use TypeScript with React. I'm a big fan of TypeScript. I like static types. It's pretty rock and roll, if you ask me. So I guess for me, I would say use React, right? If there's a compelling reason not to use React, then I guess maybe look at one of the other frameworks. But boy, it would be tough for me to make a recommendation. So the closing thoughts, okay. So the first one is that new does not automatically equal better, right? There's a bunch of new bands that always come out every year, and most of them are trash. The same is true for JavaScript frameworks, right? And they may not even be bad, they just might not be better than the previous thing that came before it. A good example that is sort of country appropriate is this. This is the lead singer of a Norwegian metal band whose name I cannot pronounce. He performs with an owl headdress on his head, which is new and interesting. We've never seen that before to my knowledge. But does it make the music better? I can't imagine it does. Maybe to some people, I don't know, the owl thing. So at the end of the day, end users don't care what JavaScript framework you use. I was working on a contract. I got pulled in because this project was failing, and they were rewriting. It was a very large American newspaper company, and they were rewriting their subscription sign-up page. It was literally a single page, not a single-page app. It was literally a single form. And another consulting firm had come in and kind of overbuilt this thing. It was crazy Angular with YAML-driven templates, whatever. And the CEO was saying, you have 2 weeks to fix this, right? You have 2 weeks to get this new design from the design team out there. I don't care how you do it. So me and the other guy that were hired to do the job, we didn't use React. We didn't use Angular. We used jQuery and Express. You know what I mean? It was as simple as it can be. We used Gulp to do all of the client-side tooling. I mean, this is in 2017, so Gulp was already kind of long in the tooth, but it was fast, it was super reliable, and they ended up making 300% additional revenue on that page once we got it out. So everybody was super happy, right? The net is that at the end of the day, the goal is to add value for your client, right? And these single-page application frameworks don't always do that. They might, but you should be skeptical. I also like to say the front end is complicated enough already without making it even more complicated. And one trope that I hear a lot is, well, Angular's really complicated, but it really shines once you get to a big application, right? That complexity becomes worth it when the app gets big enough. What? No. Something that's complicated at a small level is going to be even worse when it's at a big level, right? That's silly. And at the end of the day, less JavaScript means less things to break, right? We get several thousand JavaScript errors per second coming in the front door of Track.js, the company I run. These JavaScript apps are breaking all the time. The less of it you have, probably the better experience your users are going to have. So that's all I got. I don't want to take questions right now because the attendee party sounds like it's getting ramped up. So if you want to talk to me or yell at me or tell me I'm full of it, let's go drink some beers, huh? Thanks.